At the end of World War I, in 1919, US President Woodrow Wilson put forth a list of 14 points as the basis for a peace settlement. And one of these was the principle of self-determination. Essentially, Woodrow Wilson was asking for the independence of colonized nations. Excited at this development, a Vietnamese nationalist, along with other Vietnamese, petitioned Wilson for US help to get Vietnam free from the French. The Vietnamese petitioner was a young Ho Chi Minh, and he had just laid the groundwork towards an independent and free Vietnam. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are going to take a look at the Vietnam War, starting with the origins of the conflict and the early days of the decades-long war. Vietnam is a nation in Southeast Asia on the edge of the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, bordering Laos and Cambodia on its western side, and the South China Sea and the Gulf of Tonkin on its eastern side. The Vietnam conflict really has its roots in the French colonial rule, which started in the mid to late 19th century. The Vietnamese resisted it, the local populace was exploited, and very few were educated. And unhappy with this state of affairs, a young Vietnamese left his country in 1911 to get educated in France. His name? Ho Chi Minh. In France, he came across the works of Karl Marx and was influenced by Karl Marx's ideas on how the wealthy controlled all elements of society, including the livelihoods of lower working class. This resonated with him because this was exactly what was happening in Vietnam under the French colonial rule. And it was while he was studying in France that Ho Chi Minh got an opportunity to petition President Woodrow Wilson for help in freeing Vietnam. Unfortunately, that petition never made it to Woodrow Wilson's desk. However, the independence movement in Vietnam was gaining steam. In 1930, workers at a Michelin rubber plantation in Phu Riang went on strike for better working conditions and wages. The strike, though, was brutally crushed by the French, and punishments up to 6 years of imprisonment were handed to the ringleaders. So while more and more of these movements were rising in Vietnam, in Europe, Hitler invaded Poland, and Europe was suddenly engulfed in World War II. The French had to focus their attention on Europe to defend themselves against the Nazis, and Japan took full advantage of the situation and invaded and occupied Vietnam in 1940. The Japanese occupiers were no different from the French when it came to exploitation of the local populace. But this victory sent a very important message to the Vietnamese. The Europeans were not invincible. They could be defeated. And right around this time, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and, inspired by the Chinese and Soviet communism, formed the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh. And the primary job of Viet Minh was to start guerrilla warfare against the Japanese occupiers. The primary purpose of the Japanese occupation of Vietnam was to use Vietnam as a supply base for the Japanese army that was fighting in China. This meant that they allowed French colonial authorities to retain some power as long as they did not interfere in the Japanese supply lines. And because of this, the French were able to maintain covert Allied intelligence networks that supplied information to Allied personnel who were aiding the Chinese in their war against Japan. But by early 1945, the Japanese had become increasingly suspicious of the French activities in Vietnam and as a result, on March 10, 1945, the Japanese forces launched Operation Mago, which effectively ended French colonial rule in Vietnam. This was a huge setback to the Allies, and at this point, the United States Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, reached out to Ho Chi Minh to help drive out the Japanese from Vietnam. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, what was that? Well, during World War II, the OSS could be looked upon as the forerunner of the CIA. So the OSS reached a deal with Ho Chi Minh. They would supply weapons and training, and in return, the Viet Minh would push out the Japanese from Vietnam. But this did not prove to be a long operation, because very soon after that, the Japanese surrendered and subsequently withdrew their forces from Vietnam. Hours after signing of Japan's surrender in World War II, on September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The proclamation paraphrased the US Declaration of Independence, declaring, "All men are born equal. The Creator has given us inviolable rights, life, liberty, and happiness." And he was enthusiastically cheered by an enormous crowd gathered in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square. All right, so the World War II has ended, the Japanese have surrendered, and Vietnam is free as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Not so fast. At least that was what the French said. As soon as the Allied forces left Vietnam, the French started retaking Vietnam, coming in from the south. Apparently, the French were not ready to give up their colony yet. But Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were well settled in North Vietnam, while the French had occupied most of the south. So negotiations ensued between Ho Chi Minh and the French, and these led to an agreement in March 1946 that appeared to promise a peaceful solution. Under the agreement, France would recognize the Viet Minh government and give Vietnam the status of a free state within the French Union. French troops would remain in Vietnam, but they would be progressively withdrawn over a period of 5 years. But the French were still hung up on colonialism, and they were not ready to give up the colony. Negotiations ultimately broke down, and in late November 1946, French naval vessels bombarded Haiphong in northern Vietnam, causing several thousand civilian casualties. The Viet Minh fought back, overwhelming the French troops in Hanoi in December. And this was the start of the First Indochina War. Indochina meaning the French colonies in Indochina, which comprised Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French were very confident of victory, and they started by consolidating the South as the Republic of Vietnam, or the Associated State of Vietnam, and appointed former Emperor Bao Dai as chief of state. Incidentally, Bao Dai had fled to Hong Kong in 1946, since he did not have any role in the Viet Minh government and he did not trust the French. But when he was offered the chief of state appointment, Bao Dai agreed and returned to Vietnam in 1949. In 1949, neighboring China saw the communist Mao Zedong become leader, and he promptly decided to help North Vietnam. Mao Zedong did not want to see any Western adversary in his neighborhood, so he ensured that the Viet Minh in North Vietnam were supplied with weapons and accorded proper training in warfare. In the US, meanwhile, Harry Truman was in power, and his government was paranoid about the spread of communism in Asia. So he did what the French were hoping he would. that is, send millions of dollars in aid to help them defeat the communists in Vietnam. Though the French were supposedly in control of South Vietnam, they just controlled the large cities. The countryside was still under control of the Viet Minh. Moreover, in France, the war was turning to be unpopular. So the French decided to get more aggressive and wrap up the war quickly. Aggressive as in airdropping the troops behind enemy lines. And when I say behind enemy lines, the French airlifted troops to Dien Bien Phu, which was way up north in North Vietnam. The year was 1953, and with this airlift, the war reached a more aggressive turn. The fighting was fierce, but both sides soon realized that they could not convincingly beat the other. So they both decided to meet in Geneva to negotiate. But both wanted to get an upper hand in the battle before getting to the negotiating table. The Viet Minh started by using camouflaged cannons to bring down French enemy aircraft in the Dien Bien Phu region. With the French supply lines impacted due to this assault, the Viet Minh began a direct assault on the French. Their strategy was to dig underground tunnels to get as close to the French as possible and then emerge to engage with them from very close quarters to their base. Initially, the casualties were very high on the Viet Minh side, but finally they were able to take over the base. This defeat at Dien Bien Phu was a major embarrassment to the French. By now, President Dwight Eisenhower was the commander-in-chief in the United States, and the French promptly appealed to him for help. President Eisenhower asked for an assessment of the situation and was told that about 500,000 army personnel would be needed to stabilize the situation in Vietnam. Moreover, Eisenhower did not want to enter into another war so soon after the Korean War. Short on resources and military support from the United States, the French surrendered in Dien Bien Phu on May 7, 1954. The very next day, negotiations started in Geneva. The negotiations concluded in July of 1954 with agreements called the Geneva Accords, which were signed by the French and Viet Minh representatives. The Accords provided for a ceasefire and a temporary division of Vietnam into two military zones at latitude 17 degrees north, or the 17th parallel. All Viet Minh forces were to withdraw north of that line, and all French and South Vietnam troops were to remain south of it. So temporarily, Vietnam was divided into North Vietnam with capital at Hanoi and South Vietnam with capital at Saigon. Permission was granted for refugees to move from one region to another during a limited time period. An international commission was established comprising representatives from 3 countries to supervise the execution of the agreement. The Accords concluded with the final declaration, which provided for elections supervised by the Commission to be held throughout Vietnam in July of 1956. The aim was to unify the country. So in July of 1956, the people of North Vietnam and South Vietnam would decide whether they would unify under Ho Chi Minh or Emperor Bao Dai. Great. So in a matter of 2 years, Vietnam would be unified under one leader. Not so fast. The final declaration was never approved by the United States and Emperor Bao Dai. But why? Well, the same paranoia around communism spreading in Asia. It was very clear that if elections were held, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh would come to power with a resounding victory. In fact, President Eisenhower is supposed to have said that people knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs agreed that if elections were held in Vietnam, possibly 80% of the population would vote for Ho Chi Minh. And the communist Ho Chi Minh was not an acceptable option for the United States. And as a result, elections to unify the country in 1956 were never held. And it is around this time that the United States started getting more directly involved in the affairs of Vietnam. While the Geneva negotiations were still in progress, a plan was hatched in the United States to weaken North Vietnam through mass migrations to the south. A paramilitary unit was set up in South Vietnam under CIA operative Edward Lansdale. And Lansdale's mission was to carry out psychological warfare to induce people from the north to migrate to the south. He essentially targeted the Christian community, circulating leaflets which carried propaganda messages like Christ had migrated to the south. And the psychological warfare was successful to some extent because about 1 million people from the north migrated to the south during this period. The United States also found an able ally in Bao Dai's Prime Minister, Ngo Dinh Diem. Subsequently, a government-controlled referendum was held in the south in October of 1955, and Diem defeated Bao Dai to become the new leader in South Vietnam. Meanwhile, in North Vietnam, the biggest challenge facing Ho Chi Minh's government was economic reform and food production. The North had a chronic shortage of arable land and had never been self-sufficient. It had relied on imports of rice and other foodstuffs from the South. And that was primarily the reason the French had never tried to capture the North after World War II. In 1957, Ho Chi Minh announced a 3-year plan for the development and reorganization of the economy, and land reforms were initiated that closely followed the Chinese model. So all land was seized and redistributed to the landless peasants and then reorganized into large agricultural cooperatives, aka collectivization. However, this process of acquisition and redistribution of land slowly evolved into a campaign against the landowners. And over a period of time, thousands of landlords in North Vietnam ended up getting executed by the government officials. Ho Chi Minh himself acknowledged in 1956 that the anti-landlord campaign had gone too far and punished many people too severely. But the land reforms did yield results. Rice production reached 5.4 million tons, more than double the pre-war figures. There was growth in the production of other foods as well, including corn, sweet potatoes, and beans. North Vietnam made good progress towards heavy industry as well, thanks mainly to the assistance from its socialist allies. By 1960, the North was able to mine its own coal, manufacture its own farm machinery, and generate its own electricity. But it faced an acute shortage of skilled technicians and engineers to oversee and build larger projects. South Vietnam, too, did well economically. In 1957, Diem announced a 5-year economic plan and called for foreign loans and domestic investment. Washington, too, helped in this effort by offering incentives to American companies willing to trade with South Vietnam. The agricultural sector also saw a boom, and rice production grew from 70,000 tons in 1955 to 340,000 tons in 1960. And the United States, being its primary trading partner, helped a lot. Between 1954 and 1960, essentially the Eisenhower years, the US government pumped around $1.2 billion into South Vietnam. But about 3/4 of this aid was used to expand and bolster the military. But politically, South Vietnam was a den of corruption, nepotism, and tyranny. Premier Ngo Dinh Diem had installed his family members, friends, and political allies in important leadership positions in the government, military, business, and the Catholic Church. And his close confidant was his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu. Nhu was in charge of the organization and creation of the Army of South Vietnam, and he also ran his own private armies and anti-communist death squads. The death squads rounded up, deported, tortured, and executed thousands of South Vietnamese who were suspected of being communist sympathizers. According to some sources, more South Vietnamese were killed during Diem's 4-year anti-communist purge than during the First Indochina War. But more than the suspected communists, it was the Buddhists who suffered most under Diem's regime. More than 3/4 of the South Vietnamese population was Buddhist, but it was the minority Catholics who benefited the most under Diem's regime. The Buddhists protested across the region, but the things came to a head in Saigon on June 11, 1963. In the middle of a busy street, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc self-immolated himself to protest the mistreatment of the Buddhist community. The images and footage of Duc's suicide via self-immolation was circulated worldwide. In late August 1963, President John F. Kennedy asked his State Department to investigate the options for regime change in South Vietnam. Premier Ngo Dinh Diem was now a huge liability. So while the US was contemplating options for regime change in South Vietnam, on November 1, 1963, a group of Vietnamese army officers, led by General Dong Van Minh, assassinated Diem and his brother Nhu. However, 3 weeks later, US President John F. Kennedy himself was assassinated, and his Vice President, Lyndon B. Johnson, became the new president. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. The story of the great locomotive chase was captured in the 1956 Hollywood movie, The Great Locomotive Chase. Which production house produced this movie? The answer is A, Walt Disney. Question for the current episode. As part of the 1954 Geneva Accords on Vietnam, which 3 countries were chosen to supervise the implementation of the Accords and the election for reunification? Were these A, the US, UK, and Soviet Union? B, South Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia? C, Australia, Japan, and Iran? Or D, Canada, Poland, and India? Once again, as part of the 1954 Geneva Accords on Vietnam, which 3 countries were chosen to supervise the implementation of the Accords and the election for reunification? Were these A, the US, UK, and Soviet Union? B, South Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia? C, Australia, Japan, and Iran? Or D, Canada, Poland, and India? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we continue our coverage of the Vietnam War and enter the most bloody and conflict-ridden era of the war. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.